Um, I'm pushing them.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. To welcome you this evening to Town Hall for the Planning Committee meeting of January 9th. I'm going to call this meeting to order. A roll call of the councillors that are present this evening. From my far left, Councillor Pachariva, Mayor Easton, Councillor McPherson, and on my right, Councillor Foster and Councillor Brunet. Councillor Brunet is sitting in for Councillor Timmers as she sends her regrets this evening. From a staff point of view, to my immediate left is the Director of Planning and Development, Kathleen Dale. On my right is Legislative Coordinator Julie Kirkhalls. In the back row, I have the Clerk, William Colassa, also the Director of Corporate Services. I have Matt Bruder, who's the Associate Director of Planning and Development. I have Dave Graham, who is the Director of Public Works. And in the far end of the horseshoe, I have the Chief Administrative Officer, Mike Kokopoulos. Are there any declarations of interest this evening? Seeing none, do we have any changes to the agenda? Seeing none. So this evening we have one public hearing on the agenda. I'd like to welcome everybody to the public hearing section of the Planning Committee, and I'm advising the following. The purpose of the public meeting is to receive comments from the public regarding the draft Prudhome's secondary plan, staff report PL 1801. Any questions that arise will be dealt with in a final report, and staff will follow up if required. The Planning Act requires that before passing an official plan amendment, Council must ensure that sufficient information and material is available to understand generally the proposal being considered, and Council must hold at least one public hearing for the purpose of giving the public an opportunity to make representations regarding the proposed amendments. The Planning Act also requires that Council advises the public that the Ontario Municipal Board has the power to dismiss an appeal if an appellant has not provided Council with oral submissions at a public meeting or written submissions before any official plan amendment is adopted. If you wish to be notified of the decision, you must make a written request to the town's clerk. There is an attendance list over by the door that we would ask everybody to sign. When you sign, you automatically will be receiving notice of Council's decision. Members of the public who come forward to speak during the hearing are also asked to state their name and their address and spell the surname for the official record. Excuse me. Stress that at this point, no decision has been made by Council, and Council will take any comments received into account for their consideration of these items. After the public hearings, a recommendation report will be prepared by the Planning and Development Department, which will be considered by the Planning Committee at a future committee meeting. If approved by Council at that future meeting, a notice will be circulated to all that have registered with an appeal period identified. The hearing this evening is for the purposes of considering the draft Prudhome's secondary plan. This will be presented by staff member Matt Bruder, Associate Director for Planning and Development. The Prudhome secondary plan that is within the current official plan was originally approved in 2006. The plan has envisioned a concentration of commercial land uses supported by the development of medium and high density residential housing. It was approved prior to the implementation of several important planning initiatives that address increasing growth targets and guide corresponding development, including the 2014 Provincial Policy Statement, the 2017 Provincial Growth Plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe Places to Grow Act. Call upon Matt Bruder right now to make his presentation and provide some background for the committee and members of the public present.
Good evening, everybody. This presentation was put together to provide some background context with respect to the draft secondary plan for Prudham's Landing, as well as to get into some of the key features of the plan. This presentation was also undertaken yesterday, so I apologize to anybody that's been here for both days for the repetitiveness. Before I get into the aspects of the secondary plan, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context with respect to the major planning tool that the town utilizes with respect to development applications, and that's the town official plan. And this official plan is the roadmap that guides long-range land use and development for the town. In terms of how secondary plans fit in, they're part of the official plan. They get included into it, and they provide more detailed guidance on specific areas, such as our Prudham's Landing site. These plans provide more detail on things like land use, public spaces, building heights, environmental protections, roads, trails, and parks. And I just wanted to kind of highlight at this point that these are higher level guiding documents that the town utilizes. There is also another layer before any type of development takes place, another layer of consideration, and that's when we get into more particular things like subdivision applications, site plan applications for specific areas or even specific buildings. And at that point, that's when we, again, more carefully consider things like impacts to adjacent residences, impacts to the natural environment, making sure that there's adequate servicing for these particular development applications. So to provide a brief background, as most of you know, there is already a secondary plan that's included within the official plan. It was approved in 2006. I won't get into the main aspects of that plan, but overall, the objectives were similar to what we're trying to achieve with the updated plan, and that's to provide, a range of land uses, a range of housing opportunities, take advantage of the pristine waterfront location. However, since that plan was approved, there has been some pretty significant changes to the provincial planning landscape. Most of those are precipitated by a significant growth forecast, as you can see here on this slide. There's a significant amount of growth anticipated in Niagara region. Up until 2041, we're looking at, approximately 168,000 people that are anticipated to locate here. And that precipitates, again, some changes that have been recently completed with respect to some provincial policy documents and guidelines and legislation, including the provincial policy statement and the provincial growth plan. What these new updated plans highlight now is the importance to plan in a more compact built forum to take advantage of existing infrastructure in an efficient manner and to minimize land consumption. So to be more efficient overall in development and focus a lot of the growth in existing settlement areas. Another aspect of this is, the provincial growth targets that are handed down by the province are allocated by the region in terms of a regional municipal comprehensive review that's currently underway. So those are doled down to the local area municipalities to identify, what growth targets we need to be achieving based on provincial forecasts. So the plan vision for the updated plan, it serves to include updated policies to address the current planning policy framework, urban design practices, and market trends, and to provide for development which better accommodates the projected growth in Niagara. There are numerous components that constitute this vision, one of which is a central main street, kind of a vibrant corridor that really highlights the community there. It terminates at a waterfront park. It takes advantage of, like I said before, the pristine location. A well-designed and connected community, so we want to make sure that we have a wide range of land uses, commercial uses, office, a variety of housing types. And we want to make sure everything's connected. We want to make sure it's pedestrian friendly, it's easy to get around in those areas. There's a lot of natural features within the site that we want to make sure we maintain connectivity to as well, not just for pedestrians, not just for motorists, but in terms of just kind of wildlife corridors, especially along the waterfront, and maintain linkages as well as we can. A height strategy. We recognize, that there's communities at either end, at the east and west ends of the development that are, they're the last thing they want is to see, taller buildings right in their backyard. So we want to make sure that we have a height strategy that generally includes more low-rise development at each end, and then gradually transitioning to higher uses within the middle of the site. A public space, open space network that's connected. There's a couple of parks that I'll get into a little bit later that are visioned in the Prudhomme's Landing. We want to make sure that they're connected. Pedestrians can get back and forth, take advantage of the naturalized setting and even some of the active uses that could be implemented in those. Furthermore, in terms of active transportation, we don't want to just focus on the off-road trails, but even on the roads themselves, we want to make sure that they're highly functional for pedestrians, for cyclists, and promote ease of access. And finally, we want to make sure that we implement a build form that's compact in the sense that it supports transit-ready development. Typically, you have to make sure that you develop at a compact form that takes advantage of locations where transit may be deployed. Oops. So some of the objectives to achieve a successful community. What we want to do is we want to design a complete community. So complete community, it provides all the amenities for an individual to, undertake their daily activities and also to age in place as their lives carry on. We want to make sure we have access to things like employment areas, shopping opportunities, recreational opportunities, active transportation opportunities, just to provide people with their daily needs. Quality, we want to see well-designed buildings, public spaces, streetscapes. We want to make sure that they're highly functional, but at the same time they're cost-effective, and that they're aesthetically pleasing, they're welcoming, again, providing a sense of place in the community. We want a healthy community, and a good way to achieve that is to design it around pedestrian activity. We want to make sure we get people out of their homes, residents. We want to get tourists walking around. We want to make everybody that they're socially engaged and they're physically active. Sustainability and resiliency. We want to make sure that, as provincial legislation also requires, we have to pay more and more attention to the impacts of climate change on, how we design things like infrastructure, to how we design buildings. We want to make sure that buildings are sustainable. There's things that can be incorporated in terms of things like green roofs or other LEED accredited aspects of them. And viability, we want to make sure that, the policies within them, we incorporate enough flexibility to respond if there's any changes in market trends that occur as time goes on, since this is not just a planning document for right now, it's also a longer range tool. So the process to date, there's been quite a bit of consultation undertaken. We've had consultation with the general public. We've met with most of the landowners. And one of the key things that, again, I'd like to highlight is, we undertook a design shred even before any concepts were identified. And I think this was important because it incorporated input, it solicited input from day one. And then moving forward, there were more public information meetings with respect to the design concepts, the emerging concept, and then here we are, leading up to here we are today with our public meetings. So now I'm going to get into some of the key components of the plan. First, we're going to talk about land use and build form. As I mentioned before, we wanted to transition, especially where you see Victoria Shores at the far west end. Right over here, we wanted to make sure that we included generally more of a low-rise development. As you'll see right here, this is 2.5 stories of low-rise residential. In here, this is 3-story employment area, so things like office use, service sector, things of the like. Then we've got a 12 to 18 meter naturalized buffer going through here that will remain as is. There is some policy in the secondary plan that requires for it to be planted with some more trees. And then moving forward, we get into some mixed-use commercial in here, kind of larger unit format for those businesses that need to take advantage of the visibility along the QEW. This also provides somewhat of a buffer between here and the Main Street area and some of the other mid-rise development in here. In here is some of the Main Street mixed use. So these will tend to be smaller units of commercial space on the ground floor. Again, restaurants, shopping areas, things to really promote that energy in the downtown, that pedestrian activity, the buzz more or less is what we're looking for. So, and then in the stories above there will be provisions for some residential as well. We're looking at max 6 stories in here. As we move into residential in here, we're looking at 6 to 8 stories, and then in here, it gets 10 to 15, leading into our highest 2 buildings here and here that are 18 stories. These are, as I'll discuss a little more later, these are identified as key landmarks in the development. And then this is the marina here, with some mixed use in support of it, around 6 stories. We've got some more employment, office uses, what have you, right here, that are 4 stories. And then again, transitioning over here to the east, we have 2.5 stories of some mid-rise residential. And as you'll see, there's 2 big parks identified. There's the big waterfront park that I spoke of right here. And then over here is the other kind of more passive park that will be, more geared towards, observation of nature, walking, hiking, things of that like over here. And that'll be used as a space for the residential and the mixed use here. This here shows the road and trail network that's proposed. I just want to highlight that, there is some flexibility in the policy as development applications come in, and obviously it's subject to town review, but some of these road alignments could potentially be revised if required. But again, it would still have to meet the overall purpose. We want to maintain views to the waterfront. We want to make sure that there's constant and good flowing connectivity throughout. Another item I'd like to speak to again is in here. This is a proposed connection from the Prudham's Landing site into Victoria Shores. And what we're showing here is, we've heard loud and clear from Victoria Shores that they have concerns with respect to, too much through traffic coming in here. So we're going to be looking at opportunities to mitigate that, to minimize the amount of through traffic that comes in here. And I'll touch a little more upon that later on. The main roads here, as you'll see, there's the Main Street in here, and then there's the waterfront promenade in here. And then this road here, again, I'll talk about it a little more later too, but there is some options here too. It might end up being, right now it's shown as a local road. It might end up being a driveway heading into the employment areas too, with connection on the other side. So complete streets. What we're trying to accomplish here is we're trying to make sure that the right-of-ways in the street network are designed to accommodate all users of the right-of-way. So in other words, you're looking at motorists, cyclists, pedestrians, and we want to make sure they're accessible to all users as well. This will include things, for instance, in the waterfront promenade and the Main Street. They'll be wider, they'll have a wider amenity space, kind of like what you see over here, to accommodate maybe some patios, again, to bring life to the streetscape, to encourage people to get out, to be socially active, and really enjoy the space. As I mentioned before, there's two primary parks that have been identified or visioned in the draft secondary plan. One is the waterfront park, and that's going to be kind of the focal point. So Main Street will come to an end at kind of like a central plaza, which will be kind of, a gathering point for the community, and it'll overlook the waterfront park. Close to that central plaza, that's where kind of the more active uses, sports fields and what have you will be. And as you proceed to the waterfront, you're going to look at a little more passive uses to maintain a little more of the natural landscape, especially because there is the shoreline, and then there's the 100-year erosion limit setback, which I'll also speak to later. And then the other main park space is located further to the east, exactly to the north of the Jordan Street interchange, and that one's going to be a little more passive. There's not going to be so much in terms of active playing areas and whatnot. It's going to be reserved for more, hiking and observing, sitting, things of that like. There might also be opportunities as we proceed with development applications for other small areas to be developed as parks, and that'll be considered, as I mentioned, in the next step. In terms of natural environment, as you'll see here, 2 delineated areas. These have been identified by previous studies as candidate environmental protection areas. The status of them has not yet been confirmed, but they have been identified that they should be protected subject to a study called an environmental impact study, which would need to be completed when development applications are brought forward. So you'll see here they're overlaid on top of where there's also some potential development shown here. And the reason being is we wanted to make sure that there was flexibility in the policy to allow the boundaries of these areas to be revised if so determined to be appropriate by the environmental impact study, but at the same time ensuring that they are protected, as it clearly states in the policies that no development within the constraint areas can occur until said environmental impact study is completed and they're found to be able to be revised in their boundaries. Landmarks and gateways. As I mentioned before, the 2 main landmarks are the high-rise residential, and what we're looking for here is a signature design, something that's highly recognizable, that provides a strong sense of place, provides orientation to people going by, and makes them aware, of the Prudhome's Landing site, and entices them. And the same can be said, this is a major gateway feature identified here. This is coming off the North Service Road going down Main Street into Prudhome's. We want to make sure that we include things such as, boulevard treatments, landscape treatments, even architectural treatments at the corners to make sure that, again, this kind of signifies this as a key entrance into the community. It welcomes people. It makes them want to come in and enjoy the space. And that will be, the extent of that will be determined, again, in future development application stages. So as we've gone on, we've received comments from stakeholders, and we've identified some key considerations as well. Obviously, the first one is the road connection to Victoria Shores. We've heard loud and clear that, this is a highly sensitive issue and it needs to be addressed. The access has been identified as required based on a couple of items. First of all, when you design for a complete community, connectivity is a core principle. We want to make sure that, not just for motorists, but there's that element of pedestrian connectivity too. You don't want to silo off adjacent communities. So that was one of the factors. The other being emergency access, especially in the event if something were to happen on Victoria, that would compromise access from that way. We want to make sure that there's other efficient ways for emergency service vehicles to enter that community if needed. We definitely want to make sure that we reduce or make it unattractive for through traffic to go through there. So there are a couple of options that are going to be considered, and rest assured, we will explore these as staff, and we will bring them forward for council approval, the most appropriate ones. They could include things such as, flexible bollards. We could narrow the street with some traffic calming. There are some options there, and we will come to a decision obviously before this is brought forward as a recommendation. Another aspect is the western access off the North Service Road. There's been we've been attempting to engage MTO in some dialogue about this access and this proximity to the interchange and the impacts and possible reconfiguration requirements of the interchange. That dialogue is ongoing, but I just wanted to highlight that there still are some options, as I mentioned before, about this access. It could be more of a driveway going into the employment area, but right now it is shown as a road. So we will be working to solidify that as well, and we will be working to solicit more input from MTO in that regard. And that'll also need to be completed before we get to the recommendation report stage. Protecting natural environment. That's been another thing that we've heard loud and clear. It's a beautiful area. It contains wildlife habitat, lots of vegetation, and we want to make sure that we're very conscious and sensitive to that as we go through the development application process. There are policies within the draft secondary plan that speak to tree preservation, speak to replacing trees that need to be removed at a ratio. The town can implement this at the development application stage. So that's something, as well as street planting required within right-of-ways, looking to achieve a more mature forest canopy, where feasible. So those are policies that will be carried forward in this regard. Building heights. So we've got, like I mentioned before, we've transitioned as, for the most part, from a low-density development at either end of the site to, or a low building height rather, to a higher building height in the middle. We've got adjacent to Victoria Shores that 12 to 18 meter strip of kind of a naturalized area there that's going to be retained, should be planted with some trees. In addition to that, there's also requirements, when we look at our residential zoning and our zoning bylaw for rear yard setbacks as well, typically around 7.5 meters. That plus this buffer plus whatever the rear yard is of the existing Victoria Shores communities that abut that area, we feel would provide adequate separation. One of the items to highlight too is the Victoria Manufacturing Plant and the allotment there for higher building of 10 stories at the highest point. That particular aspect came out of some consultation with the landowner. It was also considered with respect to the placement of the highest point. There would need to be, or we would be looking for kind of more of a step back. So the highest point is kind of at the corner that's furthest away from all the residences. As it is, the building's about 85 meters from the nearest residence with some green space in behind. So once we get to the development application stage, there will be further opportunity to evaluate impacts to adjacent residences. We can request for them to undertake additional studies such as shadow and shading study to make sure that we carefully consider impacts at that time when they actually come forward with plans for a development application. Another thing that obviously has been carefully considered is adequate and efficient provision of services. The region of Niagara has considered that in their master servicing plan. They've identified some improvements that are needed to their regional sanitary system, i.e. some upgrading of the Laurie Street pumping station and the force main. The force main runs kind of from the station to the west. So there's also a gravity line in between the Prudhome's development and the station on the east. That one, at this time, it's not anticipated that it'll need to be upgraded, but in the event that it is, there are technologies that can be implemented, such as trenchless technologies to minimize impacts. So that's something that can be considered at that time. With respect to water, there is upgrading required along Jordan Road and that will go along the North Service Road as well and into Prudhome's, and that's mostly for firefighting purposes. So these things have been identified, and again, once we get to the point where we start seeing plans at a more detailed level through the development application stage, we'll further evaluate. The servicing studies are required to make sure that we do indeed have appropriate capacity to facilitate what's being proposed. Some of the constraints to development that are identified. Shoreline erosion potential. There is a required setback from the top of bank that's been identified. There is some development shown within that setback. Reason being is there might be further studies that need to be undertaken to further delineate where the setback needs to be. And another factor that might impact that distance is the shoreline protection that could be installed to kind of hinder the erosion and thus provide more room for development. So that can also be considered at a later stage when, any applicant is getting more into the design of what they're proposing to do there. The eastern portion of the Prudhome site is located within the Greenbelt Protected Countryside area. However, it's identified in the growth plan as an undelineated built-up area, and it's already zoned, and there are existing uses that are non-agricultural in nature. So there's policies included in the draft secondary plan that the existing uses and minor adjustments or expansions to these uses can occur. As it stands right now in the Greenbelt plan, if you want to completely convert the use, you would need to do an agricultural assessment as a component of that, but there is ongoing dialogue with the province in this regard due to the circumstance of it not really being a viable agricultural piece and already being zoned and used for non-agricultural purposes. I mentioned before that there might be potential interchange reconfiguration requirements. Have been some preliminary traffic studies undertaken that identify upon full build-out that there will likely need to be some revision to the interchange. This is something we've been trying to obtain more information from MTO with respect to the extent and with respect to the threshold of, how much can be built before interchange reconfiguration requirements are triggered. We've included a number in the secondary plan so that, the hope is that, MTO is part of the agency circulation. They have this for comments, so we're trying to obtain confirmation from them in this regard. And regardless, this is something that's we're going to be rectifying this and finding out what that threshold is, obtaining their input before a recommendation comes forward. So in terms of next steps, we've had the public meeting yesterday and this one today. Main purpose is to obtain input. So we're going to consider the input received after this. If required, we're going to tweak the draft secondary plan, and then following that and following resolution of some of the other things in terms of the interchange and in terms of making sure that we identify the appropriate mitigation for some through traffic into Victoria Shores, we'll be developing a recommendation report to bring forward for council consideration. That could be as soon as this spring. And if it's approved by council, notice of approval will be circulated to mark the beginning of a 20-day appeal period. And I also just wanted to note that following that, it still needs to be confirmed with Niagara Region, but it is likely that this will also need to be approved by their council as well. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll welcome any questions.
Thank you very much, Matt. Appreciate the detailed overview. Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you. First of all, thanks, Matt. And I was one of the ones that sat through this last night too. So I've been able to think about a few things overnight as well on this. So first of all, you talked about the next steps, considering that approvals may come into play. Can you talk about with us the next steps after that? In other words, site plan and what has to be done, because one of the key things that came up during the discussions in last night's meeting was infrastructure and making sure that the parking is well thought out, making sure that the water is well thought out, making sure that the road alignment is what it is that's expected, the sanitary sewers, and making sure that all of that is going. So can you explain to us the next step after all of this, because it is fairly significant, if I'm not mistaken.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe, you're talking about the next stage that I've been referring to, the development application stage. So when we receive, for instance, a plan of subdivision for a specific area, or even a site plan for, say, an apartment building, we typically require that the applicant come in for a pre-consultation with staff. That's when we get everybody in the same room and we go over the plan in kind of a preliminary detail to make sure we confirm feasibility that yes, on a high level, servicing looks like it will accommodate the development. They're meeting their zoning requirements. If not, they'll require amendments, like we identify those things for them. Once they get through that, then they have to submit, typically according to the requirements of the development application. So if it were, a site plan, they would need to submit a functional servicing report to make sure the servicing, this is kind of more of a detailed review of their servicing to make sure that it will indeed accommodate what they're proposing. They'll have to submit a site plan showing what their parking is going to be, if they're going to have underground parking. They'll have to submit landscaping plans to make sure that they comply with the town's urban design guidelines with our landscaping requirements. And all of that data will be circulated, it'll be circulated to town departments for review. It'll be circulated, to the region for review to make sure that they're complying with all applicable policies. And then, if they need to make revisions, there's some to and fro there to achieve what we need to achieve, and that's typically how the process goes. And then we move forward with establishing the site plan agreement or the plan of subdivision.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Good explanation. Question through you, Mr. Chair. So things like water, you know, we're into, if we move forward with what we're expecting here, there's going to be 18-story buildings apparently built, and that's a whole new type of infrastructure for this municipality. So, you know, we haven't built anything near close to that. In fact, you know, there's a couple of places in Beamsville that are going to be built up to 8 stories apparently at some point. But so the question is, do we have to go to outside help for some of these things as we're looking at them? Like this is because this is a fairly significant change to infrastructure that we would be going into. So I don't know, Mr. Chair, through to whom is appropriate with that.
Well, through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps I'll start. I mean, it's not unusual for us to, you know, sometimes require, especially for a more complex development, maybe a third-party review of what the servicing report is recommending, just to make sure that it will indeed address and meet the requirements of the proposed development. So yeah, there could be potential that we would look at, you know, obtaining a third party to give us another opinion on that. I'll look to Director Graham if he wants to provide any further input in that regard.
Through Mr. Chairman, yes, we would be, when we're initiating the design for the water main upgrade, we would be getting help from consulting engineers who specialize in water distribution designs for those types of land use buildings, et cetera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just one last thing. Having been involved with the 2006 secondary plan that we did, as well as this one coming forward, I think the key thing that needs to be noticed by everyone is that there's been a real move by this council as well as previous councils to make sure that the waterfront is a key component for the community. I think we have been completely consistent right from the start. I was very pleased to see when the charades were going on and dealing with that, the similar things were coming in. But you know, we have been very consistent with that for 20 years on what we want to see with this. So that's one of the things that I think is absolutely superb about the thing. I mean, we can argue about building size and everything else, but maintaining that waterfront is critical to the long-term welfare of both Lincoln and for Niagara. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Patrieva?
Yeah,
and
thank you, Mr.
Councillor
Chairman.
Nicholson.
Through you, and this kind of dovetails right into Councillor Foster's finishing comments about the waterfront. And I sat through the presentation last night, Matt, and thank you for that. And I didn't say anything. I took a lot in, and when I was driving today, I was thinking. And you mentioned waterfront promenade a couple times, and all of a sudden it clicked. Active transportation. The waterfront trail presently through our town is rather mundane. It exists on the North Service Road. Having been involved in that ride a few years ago, you know, you leave Niagara Falls, you ride through trails and things through St. Catharines, and we come to the town of Lincoln, and we had a staging area at Charles Daly Park, and then we ride the North Service Road. As a kid, I remember driving along Lakeshore Road. I used to go to the bottom of Ontario Street and make a right. And we chatted about this through active transportation. I think this is an opportunity to reestablish that waterfront trail, whether it be through or on the waterfront promenade, or run that entire length, you know, the kilometer length from the foot of Jordan Road to the base of Victoria Avenue, and reestablish that. And just wondering if we need to implicitly state that in the secondary plan, or is that something that can come out of it? And then, you know, two, we had you know, talked about active transportation. We can have that conversation there, and I'm sure that committee will be actively involved, you know, because it goes back to, you know, a couple of the road closures that we had, and looking at those along that lakeshore to be able to reestablish that. You know, Councillor Foster said, oh, waterfront's paramount. This is the last chunk that we have. So we got a chance to do something. We got a chance to right a wrong, I guess. So just wondering your thoughts on that.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, actually, there is intent to, you know, kind of reestablish the pedestrian kind of component of the North Service Road. I think the intent is along the Prudhoe site where the service road is to upgrade that. I think we're going to see curbs and sidewalk there eventually with a treated boulevard edge. That's been brought up before, so I think there's a good likelihood of that happening.
But I mean, actually taking that trail and running it through the center. So it would actually provide sorry, Mr. Chairman. It would actually provide the commercial area would provide a node, a jumping off spot, right? And just about connectivity and things like that, so.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, something that can be looked into. Like as you saw in the plan, within the site itself, there is a trail along the total 3-kilometer expanse or for the most part, along the waterfront. So, that's something certainly that we could look into. Maybe it's a component of the transportation master plan,
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councilor McPherson and then Mayor Easton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and a couple of things. So one of the things that was asked last night and we shared last night was an estimate of the numbers for the community. And it is an estimate at this point, but through you, Mr. Chair, could we share that number again tonight?
Yeah. Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the estimate in terms of population increase within the Prudhoe site is around 6,000 to 7,000 for the entire site.
Thank you. So going through the secondary plan, and again, that we can't do a development without talking about parking. So I'm going to talk about parking for a minute. So in the secondary plan, we do call out parking for the residents of the town, of the community. But I didn't see anywhere in there where we're designating parking for visitors to the downtown or visitors to the park, where we're calling this out as a destination, if you will. And I wonder if we're missing that. Through you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. So, good question. There's definitely the need for visitor parking that is going to be in the area. One of the ways that that's addressed in the draft plan is you'll see in a lot of the designations, the land use designations in terms of all the residential and even some of the mixed use, the parking is actually included as a permitted use within those. And in addition to that, there's going to be on-street parking identified. It's actually identified within the secondary plan as a good traffic calming measure too, and providing good separation from, pedestrians and motorists. So that's something that's going. I don't have details of how it's going to be provided yet, but that's something that there is allowance in the policy to permit on-street parking throughout where appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Bruder. And I think we should just be giving that some thought, Mr. Chair, as far as is that going to accommodate the folks that want to use the park, and we're asking them to park on the street somewhere, or is there a need for a parking lot closer to the park? Just a question. If I may, Mr. Chair. We probably have a number of Victoria Shores folks here again tonight, and certainly there is a lot of communications that's come to us over all of the public meetings with regards to the road going into Victoria Shores. And, we've communicated now that the road is being built for a lot of reasons. Being built for connected communities, being built for EMS access. And we've also talked about traffic mitigation. And it's still not clear to me what that traffic mitigation is going to be. And I'm just wondering, when is that decided? How is that decided? Does that come back as part of the overall plan that we have made a recommendation, our staff has made a recommendation, and we approve that? Is that the way it works? Through you, Mr. Chair?
Through you, yes. That what we would do is we would come back. When it comes time to come forward with a recommendation, we would have the recommended mitigation method at that time, and that would be incorporated into the secondary plan. So yes, at that point, then you would be able to make a decision on what that measure would be.
Okay, because as far as I know, this is the final public meeting, I would think. So I think we need to be clear on how that is going to be arrived at. And I guess, and thank you, Mr. Bruder. And finally, just the MTO thing, a lot of discussion last night about the interchange. And just for tonight's group here, it's discussion around do they get involved, or when do they get involved? How does that whole decision get made as far as any change to the off QEW interchange? Through you, Mr. Chair.
You mean who, the MTO, when do they get involved?
Well, just where are we at with that? And there was discussion around the potential for starting the project and then getting a ruling after the project is starting, and, getting, potentially a change to the off-ramp on the QEW.
Well, the goal at this time would be, we developed this draft plan, as I mentioned, with the threshold that MTO is reviewing. Like they're a reviewing agency. They should be reviewing this plan. We're hoping to solicit input from them, but we would want input from them before we come forward with a recommendation. That's the goal at this point. But as of right now, we are still trying to obtain that input from them. It's been an ongoing process to date.
Actually, if I can interject, I think Mr. Kokopoulos has some comment to that as well.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I want to echo, I think similarly on the MTO question, some of the comments I made last night, and I didn't, and I want to echo them now versus later on in the evening, because I don't want people to leave thinking that we haven't necessarily done the follow-up with the MTO. I think typically the process with the MTO is until there's a development application in front of them, they typically refrain from providing comment. There's a number of developments that have occurred throughout Niagara and other jurisdictions where the MTO 3 years after the build is still being sought after to provide impact and input into what that will look like. We've set a target that we believe is an appropriate target for development to proceed with only minor upgrades or minor amendments to the interchange as it currently stands. We believe this will precipitate and generate a conversation with MTO once they see it as a reviewing agency, and so that we can move forward in a phased approach with this particular development, knowing that this development will be a multi-year, multi-phase development, and that MTO will get involved if and when they deem the upgrades requiring more of a substantive assessment than currently sits. So we have, since last night, reached out to MTO again to try to saber rattle, I think, a little bit more attention, seeing the direction we received last night, and anticipate, hopefully before we come back in February with more input, but notwithstanding that, are taking a phased approach with the development, anticipating MTO at some point comes back to us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mary Easton. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of points that I wanted to touch on, and some of them I discussed last evening, but we do have a completely different crowd here this evening. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Bruder, on the matter of the MTO, is MTO engagement, does it have a bearing on the timing of council approval in any way?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, I don't think it does.
Okay. I was very interested in Councillor Foster's question, and your answer certainly laid out quite clearly those next steps after council approval and the phases that we go through. And I would also, Mr. Chairman, through you, like to make a point that I think there will be policy direction, particularly around items like parking, which may require us to enter into agreements, as we never have before, around paid parking or not. This is not uncommon, I understand, in areas where you have a mix of activity with ownership plus tourism. And I'm particularly appreciative of the way you describe that theme and that vision that we have for this property, that there will be, that the people who come to live here need to understand that the plan is to invite other people onto this property and for them to enjoy this property. And I think really it's one of the benefits of starting with a clean slate, because you're not bringing that down on people that already live there, but everyone comes in or should come in with a clear understanding of this. But I do think it's a real benefit to the area to have that type of activity. Mr. Chairman, last evening, through you, I spoke about the 18 stories. So I certainly one person around the table, I don't know where other councillors stand, but I'm interested in having more stories, because this is a piece of property that will be designed now and forever into the future. And so having those signature buildings there is going to be very important. You clarified for me last night that this is the kind of thing that the ministry are interested in. You also clarified the fact that there are studies that need to be done to ensure that the Victoria Shores residents are not impacted in any way with shade, with the loss of sunshine, if you will, and the lack of enjoyment. In thinking about this, do you have anything more to add to this? Because it's not a matter of height or no height. It's a matter, like everything else, of finding a way to interpret and evaluate what the impact will be on having more height.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I mean, the shadow and shading study is just one aspect. I mean, there's other items with respect to the design of the buildings themselves that could mitigate impacts to the adjacent residences too. You know, I kind of briefly touched upon, you know, the potential to step buildings away from residences, so the highest component is furthest away. Even simple things, you know, if you're talking about things such as privacy, there's strategic placement of windows and things like that that could be considered as well during the future site plan process when a design comes in. So there's multiple avenues we can explore when it comes to mitigating impacts as best we can, and that those things, you know, they do get reviewed by virtue of the development application process.
And so, Mr. Chairman, through you, somewhere in this document, and I wouldn't be able to find it now, there was a reference made to architectural standards and the fact that where necessary, architectural standards, although we weren't planning to pass a specific bylaw, that there was a provision for architectural standards, I don't think that's the right term, for architects to be consulted on building design in order to make the placement of a building, the placement of windows, some of those details more acceptable to the adjacent property owners. Could you just touch on that a bit?
Sure. I think what you're talking about is, you know, before a site plan gets approved, especially one with a higher building height, or, you know, even when we come to plans of subdivision too, maybe in areas that are going to be built in a more compact built form, there is an opportunity to engage, you know, to have someone review it in terms of architectural control. We have architectural control guidelines and urban design guidelines in the official plan. So this is kind of a final review to make sure that, you know, the design is meeting the intent of those policies in the official plan. So that is something that is undertaken as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I also want to speak on the issue of the road connection from the perspective that council, and this is really clarification for the audience, if you will permit me. Council expects the staff to come forward with a recommendation that is based on good planning principles. We don't expect them to make political decisions. And we are well aware of the concerns, and Mr. Gillespie brought me a couple of other letters this evening. And it is up to the council to determine what those mitigations are going to be. And it is our plan to address the recommendations that come forward by the staff in terms of what they could be. Now, my interpretation of this comes directly from an experience I had this past summer when I was at the Parliament buildings. And they have these very large bollards that sink down into the ground when there's an appropriate vehicle that's to be allowed onto the property. And you can only get in there if someone pushes a button or if you have a remote control. So these are mechanisms that are tried and true. I don't think anybody would, I certainly don't believe that the residents of Victoria Shores should have to deal with fighting with additional traffic or any irritation, really, during the construction process. We certainly understand that. So I think you should leave here tonight knowing that this is a top-of-mind issue, but you should not expect the staff to bring in a recommendation that there will be no connection, because we would consider that to be inappropriate as a council for them to interpret good planning principles in that way. So I think the bollards, myself, I like them. I saw them in operation. I actually stood there for a while to watch how this worked, and nobody was getting by them. They're very big. They're about 12 inches in diameter, and they were very close together, and they move very smoothly up and down. Now, I know in Europe there are some that you actually have to remove and take out of the road. These did not work like that. This was a very automated system. So, so I think the solution to your concern is certainly out there, and it's one that obviously will come to us when the final report is brought forward. Mr. Chairman, my personal interpretation of the report is that staff have taken into account planning policies. There are many of them, as you know, many layers of them. We don't really expect everyone to understand every detail, but I must say that from the very beginning, we've had well over 100 people who have been engaged in this process. They've come forward and been committed to the process, which I think is remarkable. I'm a particular fan of the charrette process. I think it really brought the community forward in a position of laying out the guiding principles for this project. I think just in terms of the past documents, it was a good sign to see that attitudes hadn't changed much, particularly in terms of access to the waterfront. We also had an unprecedented level of commitment and cooperation from both the developers and the consultants. It is not necessary for communities to go to battle with developments when communities know what the vision is for their community. Your advocacy has helped with that, and it continues to help with that. But it is important for you to know that those planning policies that are in place at the provincial and regional level are not something that we can wiggle too far from. And understanding those is quite important. There are going to be more engineering opinions come forward, and we need to pay attention to those. They are the people that we can hold accountable if there are errors and omissions. It is the professional engineers that we can hold accountable if misjudgments are made. And so there will be more advice coming forward to the staff. Other than that, Mr. Chairman, I think we have made some very good progress with this, and I appreciate the time you've given me. Thank you.
Thank you. Try and limit our speaking to questions to the staff member, if that's possible. Councillor Petriva, did you want one more question?
No,
okay.
I'm all good.
Thank you very much. Councillor Bernay, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Thompson. Through you to Mr. Bruder. Matt, you spoke last night and again tonight about a number of things that came out of the charrette, as Mayor Easton just alluded to. You know, one of the things that I remember clearly when I attended the charrettes was what the parks and open spaces would look like. I realize we're very premature here, but we've got, a wonderful landscape here of property to work with. Can you give us some indication of how that process will take place as we move forward on ultimately what these parks and open spaces will look like?
Yep, through you, Mr. Chair. So, yeah, like you mentioned, it is early. I mean, I can give you some, or I have already given you kind of some preliminary indications of what they could look like, especially with the waterfront park. I think that's where some of the more active uses could be, maybe some fields, maybe some, I don't know, playground. I don't know yet, but I mean, that compared to the other park that's further east, that one would be a lot more passive, be very naturalized over there. There might be some furniture there in terms of benches and what have you, and something to facilitate the community that way, but it'll be a lot more naturalized than the main waterfront park would be. When we get to that stage, it'll be a component of, how we've been dealing with a lot of the other park developments. I mean, I think it'd be, depending on what the design, what we vision further when that time comes, there would be a process involved, a design process. It would be probably a consultant process to come up with a design and move forward in that manner. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Again, my next question through you, Mr. Chair. Again, through the charrette process, we heard from a lot of the residents about the protection of the significant wildlife habitat, the natural environment, the conservation area. You spoke in your presentation both last night and tonight about the next steps and the environment, and there'll be an environmental impact study. Roughly at what stage, like how far down the road are we until that takes place?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So environmental impact studies are typically undertaken, as I mentioned before, during the process that I outlined for Councillor Foster, when it comes time when a development application is received for that specific area. That'll be identified as a requirement that's going to need to be obtained prior to any approvals being issued, that there can't be any development happening, any shovels in the ground until they've addressed that.
Okay, and my last question through you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Bruder. Last night, Mayor Easton asked some questions about, what she was maybe looking for above and beyond what she was seeing at this point. And some of the words that I wrote down last night that you indicated last night were storm retention, gray water, LEED certification, technology, heat recovery, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, is this going to be in conjunction with us and the developer? How is this process ultimately move forward in terms of what these buildings and these extras, like whether a building is LEED certification or not, and the technology involved in that building? What is that a hand-in-hand thing as we move forward here? Maybe it's premature, but just a question.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So that, yeah, those there is verbiage to that within the draft plan, more of guiding verbiage than anything else. It's not necessarily a requirement, but typically, again, that would come out, when the design of the buildings is being undertaken. LEED certification is something that's, obtained through the Canada Green Building Council, I believe. So there's a whole process that the applicant would need to undertake with that specific agency. It's not something, I mean, we would provide any assistance we could if that's the way they want to go, because we want to encourage these things. But ultimately, approval of the actual LEED certification wouldn't come from us. It would come from that party. But it would, that would need to be undertaken when the building's being designed, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Foster, one last question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And it's just around the waterfront again. And I was thinking we had some pretty significant problems this past year with waterfront elsewhere, down along, down through the lake shore and into Charles Daly Park. And of course we spent, probably close to $1 million to help mitigate things, and we got a significant amount of money back from the provincial government to help with the emergency measures. But it's sort of, as I'm thinking about that, it does bring up the question about how that waterfront is going to be developed. So one of the things that I'm going to be looking for in the site plan as we move forward is first of all, who we're going to get involved with that and how we're actually going to do it, because, you know, whatever we're developing there, we really don't want something that's going to be, you know, destroyed by ice or whatever the case may be, or the type of storms that we've seen coming in as well. So, but I'm assuming that's part of the site plan as we go through, or I would assume.
Yeah, that's correct, Councillor, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Matt. I appreciate you coming up and answering all these questions. At this point, I'd like to call upon those who have requested to speak at this evening's public hearing. For those of you who would like to speak, I would like to mention that this is not a question and answer session. Rather, all comments tonight will be made part of the submission and considered for the final recommendation staff report. So please keep your comments brief and to the point. We have Francine Kell to speak to report PL 1801. And Francine, you came yesterday. So, Francine, you came yesterday to committee and expressed your concerns regarding the increase in population, which our CAO confirmed was potentially around 6,000 to 7,000 in size, as well as the road access through Victoria Shores subdivision to the Prudhomme secondary plan area. Those concerns have been heard and have been considered. So do you have any new concerns you'd like to express this evening, or comments that you'd like to express this evening?
Yes, this is a comment, not a question.
Perfect. Please go ahead.
Okay. Doing some research on the web today. Census Canada from 2016 shows the population of Vineland, good Vineland on Lincoln, as 4,074. So adding the additional 7,000 residents down to the Prudhomme area, that increases the, it just makes Vineland gigantic in size from 4,000, and double, tripling the population.
Sorry. Is the red light on the microphone?
No, now it is, sorry.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that.
Sorry. Census Canada 2016 shows that the population of Vineland alone is just 4,074. By adding the 7,000 more residents to the Prudhomme's area, the population just explodes. To me, it seems like the downtown of Vineland will now be strategically Prudhomme's development. So going forward, it could be an amazing, beautiful opportunity for a downtown, and hopefully not taking away from the old downtown and incorporating it somehow. The Lincoln website itself is quoting "Living in Lincoln, Lincoln gives you breathing space. Lincoln commute can happen easily by car, no traffic jams or hours wasted in traffic. So hopefully the traffic study will alleviate any congestion, especially with the considerations of the summer traffic on the QEW. That's almost like a parking lot itself. So getting people to this destination, this community, you know, the access off the highway. I don't know if any of you have been stuck in the traffic just trying to get off of Victoria Avenue. And my big concern is the removal of the remaining habitat. We're pretty fortunate to live at Victoria Shores. There are 4 bald eagles that we see constantly there, and we have some beautiful owls. It would be a shame to have the remaining trees removed. So if possible, in your studies, if that can be considered, it's pretty rare to see bald eagles. It's a beautiful neighborhood. It's a beautiful piece of property. And I hope with the development, it's going to be a pretty amazing place.
Thank you very much. We have Liz Benion to speak to PL 1801. Please come forward. Thank you for joining us this evening. Please go ahead.
So good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is Liz Benion. You wanted the spelling of the last name. It's Benneian. I live at 3150 Culp Road in Vineland. Thank you for allowing me to speak tonight on the Prudhoe Secondary Plan. I have attended previous meetings on this plan, and I've read through the plan as presented to you tonight. First, I'm pleased to see the sustainability guidelines included in the plan. These include the green building design, protection of natural features, and provision for multimodal transportation network. I was also pleased to read the phasing strategy that includes the securement of natural features and the dedication of the designated parks and open space lands into public ownership. I do, however, have some concerns and questions in a few key areas of the plan. Under sustainability objectives on page 5, there is a list of laudable goals, including the first of which is to protect and enhance local and regional ecosystems and biological diversity. Giving added emphasis to this goal would go a long way in addressing many other goals in the plan, from reducing CO2 emissions to mitigating erosion and flooding and to creating healthier communities. Green space isn't just a nice thing to have. The natural environment provides innumerable green infrastructure benefits that complement, support, and reduce the need for built infrastructure and the costs that entails. I would also like to suggest that the first objective of protecting and enhancing local and regional ecosystems and biological diversity cannot be met if you allow the planting of non-native species. Ohio, New York, and Maryland are just some of the places that have enacted laws banning the sale of invasive plants because they have recognized the devastating impact these plants are having on our environment. In fact, my sister just built a house in a new development in Tennessee where landscaping of native plants was required and where the developer used that as a selling feature. Non-natives that aren't recognized as food sources by our local insects and other animals are contributing to a cataclysmic loss of biodiversity. Now, I know you can't ban the sale of invasives or non-native plants, but you can require natives to be planted. Native plants can be described as plants that were here before the Europeans arrived. They have evolved over millennia, and they are the plants which our local creatures recognize as food. The importance native plants have in protecting and enhancing biodiversity cannot be overemphasized. For instance, entomologist and author Doug Ptolemy notes that 95% of our birds feed their young on insects and their larvae. They feed off our native plants. A small bird like a chickadee requires 5,000 insects that can be found within a 50-meter radius of the nest per each clutch of hatchlings. When we plant non-natives that support no local food sources to a chickadee, it's like there's no trees at all. So I suggest the urban forest policy on page 12 should be significantly strengthened by inserting the word native in section B. The urban forest shall include a variety of native trees that are hardy, resilient, etc. The plan does say native tree species are preferred, but that carries no weight, and in fact guarantees that non-natives will be planted. Similarly, the creating and protecting greenland section on page 50, part N, could be strengthened by adding native into that section. Any planting occurring in the natural environment designation shall include non-invasive native drought-resistant plantings, etc. Finally, in the section on street trees, page 66, the wording should be amended in section 5 to say a diversity of drought-tolerant, non-invasive, salt-tolerant native tree species should be considered. We often hear that non-natives have to be planted because natives can't tolerate urban conditions. That is simply not true. There are many native species that make excellent street trees, and many of our native species come in so many varieties that you're sure to find one for almost any condition. For instance, there are about 90 varieties of Native American oaks. We have provided staff with preliminary native tree, shrub, and wildflower landscaping lists, which we will continue to add to and will deliver to them when complete. Additionally, I would like to suggest that the town develop and/or adopt street tree planting guidelines that set minimum requirements for both quantity and quality of soil. The goal in this section states all trees shall provide a large canopy and shade over sidewalks, parks, and open spaces. It has been long recognized that street trees in newly developed areas faced a host of issues, from soil compaction to reduced soil volumes, that significantly, detrimentally impact tree health. Or as I say more succinctly, we stick them in the ground, torture them for a few years, and then replace them. It is commonly assumed street trees in new areas will never live to become the majestic large canopy trees that this plan calls for and that we enjoy in older areas. Many communities from Markham to Oakville to Richmond Hill have created requirements for both quality and quantity of soil for street trees. Example of these policies have also been provided to town staff. In the section on creating and protecting greenlands in the natural environment designation, under permitted uses on page 49, it states, in F, permitted uses on lands within the natural environment designation may include a number of uses, including municipal infrastructure and conservation and flood control projects. My concern here is that the areas designated as natural environment are actually, for the most part, thin ribbons of green space through which, as per Schedule D, you are planning to run trails. If this space is further used for municipal infrastructure and flood control projects, which I presume include stored water management ponds, how much natural environment will be left? Further, stormwater management ponds are infrastructure that should be built outside of lands designated as natural environment. Overall, I'm pleased to see and I support the recommendations on stormwater management on page 70, including the use of permeable surfaces wherever possible. I would ask that if stormwater management ponds are to be employed, could they please be integrated into the community as a design feature, as so many communities do, and not fenced off, as has been the policy in the town of Lincoln. For a beautiful local example of the stormwater pond in a residential community, you can look next to Niagara College. Regarding the multi-use trails on page 66, I note that it calls for them to be a minimum width of 3.5 meters and up to 6 meters. That's 20 feet wide. That's not a trail, that's a road. Even 3 meters with 1 meter mode buffers on either sides with requirements for them to be lit and likely de-iced in winter will cause significant amounts of damage to natural areas. I was not clear from reading the plan whether these trails are intended only for open spaces and buffers or if they would extend into areas designated as natural environment. I hope they will not be allowed in the limited natural environment areas as they will defeat the purpose. I also have some special concerns about the constraints on Schedule 2, E2, E3, and E4, but I'll convey those concerns when the studies move ahead. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you. Can you please
I have copies.
submit a report to the clerk so that we have that to add to the presentation? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next we have John Armstrong. Speak to report PL 1801.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is John Armstrong. I live at 4223 Lincoln Avenue in Beamsville. And I'm here actually today on behalf of an organization called Masonry Works. And Masonry Works is the professional association for Ontario's brick, block, and stone sector. And we represent manufacturers, suppliers, and contractors. We're here today because we have a province-wide initiative called Building Tomorrow's Heritage Neighborhoods Today. And our goal is to help municipalities build to a higher standard by recommending language and policy for municipal official plans, secondary plans, and urban design guidelines. First off, we want to congratulate the town staff on developing a strong draft for the new Pridham secondary plan. I've lived in Beamsville for many years, and so I'm excited to see this development actually taking some shape. We've got a couple of comments to make as far as how to best deliver on some of the policies in the plan, and I'll only take up a few minutes of your time. Masonry Works has been following the development of this plan for some time, and we've been pleased to offer feedback at various previous open houses. We've seen a lot of changes recently with how planning is done in the province of Ontario. There are new directives that are forcing communities to significantly increase density. Climate change is pushing us towards building in ways that our buildings can handle extreme weather impacts, wind shear, flooding, and fluctuating temperatures. And climate adaptation is augmented by the need for us all to do our part to reduce our carbon footprint. Right now, the current official plan projects that 29,000 people will live in Lincoln by 2026. According to the last census, we jumped 5.8% in our population to almost 24,000. And I heard today that this development is 6,000 to 7,000, so that actually pushes us over the 29,000 by 2026. But of course, it's going to take some time to build this plan out. But if we're going to be providing housing and a new downtown for another 6,000 to 7,000 people here in Lincoln, as well as many visitors, it's really important that we get it right and that we build beautiful neighborhoods that will last for generations. And the previous speaker was talking about the natural environment. I'm actually here talking about the built form and the importance it is to pay attention to the built form in this plan as well. The draft plan sets out the objectives for having high quality architecture. You talk a little bit about opportunities to raise the bar on urban design and showcasing a high-quality destination for both residents and visitors. That's particularly important in an area where the density will be much higher than we're used to here in Lincoln, as well as showing the kind of community that we are to the millions of travelers who traverse the QEW every year. We were pleased to see the plan speaking to sustainability by requiring regionally and locally sourced building materials to the greatest extent possible. And with your guidelines for low-rise apartments, you do get specific about materiality or exterior building materials, and you actually do encourage the use of high-quality masonry. It's important for everyone to understand that municipalities have the opportunity to have an impact on the exterior of a building in their official plans and in their secondary plans. They don't have any impact. You can't make any changes that would require changes to the inside of a building, but you actually have a great deal of control when it comes to the exterior of a building. Needless to say, we think it was a good choice to encourage high-quality masonry because we believe that it'll serve the community very well for many decades to come. It will reduce maintenance costs. It will keep your assessments very high. It will be climate resistant, and it will also help reduce your carbon footprints. We do, however, think it would be valuable to hold all types of buildings and the built form to the same high standard in this development. We see with many municipalities leading the way on urban design that it is they that set out some specific guidelines for building materials, whether it be for single-family homes, townhouses, or taller apartments, condos, and mixed-use buildings. These will often specify materials the municipality prefers, and in some instances, specifying the materials that they, in fact, discourage. We encourage you to take a look at some of these examples before finalizing that plan. And some good examples for you that the municipality may want to look at would include Whitby, Guelph, and Brampton. Not paying attention to that part of the plan really does leave the door open for lower quality buildings that will age poorly over time. Through the use of site plan control, which can be extended to residential units under 25, a municipality has the power to exercise this kind of input for virtually any building in the community. And the province of Ontario has, in fact, been granting more and more authority to municipalities to control the building designs in their communities because they know how significant an impact the building stock has on that community. We'd also encourage you to include the best practice of requiring that all sides of a building meet the same high standards as are often required on the front. Builders and planners have in fact done a good job over the last number of years working on the front facade of residences and buildings, and we believe the rear facade is every bit as important as the front. Some call this focus on the front of the buildings alone a false fronting, and we like to actually call it the Hollywood set effect, because it looks great on the front, but when you go in behind, there's really nothing there. As densities increase, homes and backyards become closer together, and in many ways, these areas have almost become semi-public realms. And we really believe that this is the next realm of focus for good urban and architectural design, and that's the rear facade. That's especially true if you're designing for this new signature Lincoln neighborhood with taller buildings and all that visibility from the QEW. again, we're pleased to see the planning process for Pridham's moving forward, and we hope to stay engaged as the plan is finalized. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, John. Certainly, if you would kindly deposit a copy of those notes to the clerk, that would be extremely helpful. To
Absolutely, and we'll give you a side-by-side, or we'll give you a line-by-line recommendations as well.
That would be fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have Cheryl Selig. If you'd like to come forward, please.
Good evening, Mr. Chair. I'm a land use planner with T. Johns Consulting, and we represent two different landowners in the Prudhoe secondary plan area, and I'm just here to make representation on their behalf this evening. So the first property, we represent the landowner of 4933 Victoria Avenue, which is Court Holdings at the end of Victoria Avenue. We've been engaged with staff from the beginning of the process, and we are here tonight actually to voice our support for the current policies in the plan. We think that the proposed heights represent good land use planning given the location of the property. It's bound obviously by Lake Ontario. It's at the end of Victoria Avenue. There's a significant natural vegetated buffer between the property and Victoria Shores. So for this reason, we think that the proposed medium density development is appropriate for this site. Also, given the heights that are proposed, we can reduce the massing of the building, and the proposed heights are necessary in order to meet the density targets. We have done a little bit of work with the landowner to understand how we achieve the proposed density in relationship to the massing on the site, just to know whether or not those heights are applicable for the expected densities. And we've come to the conclusion that the proposed heights do correlate with the proposed densities for the site. And by allowing height, we can reduce the massing and push the building away from the existing low density residential. So for these reasons, we think that the proposed policies for that site represent good land use planning, and we support those policies. Does anybody have any questions on that part before I move to the second site?
Councillor Foster.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, that's an interesting analysis that you put in place for that. And having been involved a long time with planning here at our council as well, I'm curious, does a municipality look just at a piece of property for densities, or does it look at a municipality as a whole when things are happening, generally speaking?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there are targets for the overall area, but there's also targets if you have a medium density designation on your site for a density that you would have to achieve with your proposed development.
Okay, I'm going to leave that one for later. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so the second property that we represent is located at 2793 Beacon Boulevard, and that is the Beacon Hotel. And again, we've been engaged by the landowner to work with them through this process, and we made a submission to planning staff. Upon receiving the latest draft, we are generally supportive of the policies in the most recent draft for the Beacon Hotel site. We particularly are supportive of the policies with regards to the special policy area. And at this time, our only small outstanding concern that we've already discussed with staff relates to the line for the land use designation, and we would just like to see it align with our property owner's property versus cutting through the middle of the property. And I think that's something that will be addressed in the revised plan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next on our list is Randy Harris. Please come forward.
Thank you very much. My name is Randy Harris. I live at 10 Beverly Grimsby. That's Harris. Since I'm not allowed to ask a question, I'll start with a test. What is on the sign for Welcome to St. Catharines? Nobody? Sailboat. Sailboat on the sign. If I give you one takeaway, I'll give it to you right now, and that would be to actively pursue a yacht club. I hear lots of good phraseology to the waterfront, the activities, giving people quality of life, concern for the environment, carbon footprint, and so on. And the simple answer to all that is a sailing club. Sailors can bring a dynamic to the community of volunteer opportunities. People love seeing sailboats sitting at docks, the ting, ting, ting of the masts, especially when they're out sailing back and forth in front of your homes, in front of the restaurants. I've been doing sailing for 30 years, and you always get comments when you come back to shore how much people enjoyed seeing you, at what point they saw you, your colors, and so forth. I should be a little more specific. First of all, in reference to the present facility, it's very well run. The people are excellent, and the on-the-site operator is fantastic. So I don't know if that's part of the future, but it's an opportunity to say that whoever's involved in making that happen, it's done very well. I've been 30 years, Lake Simcoe, Lake Ontario, Lake Erie Yacht Clubs, Lake Couchiching. I've been at marinas. I've been two marinas and a yacht club on Lake Ontario, and this is one of the better experiences I've been having, and they put a lot of emphasis in getting the right people, and it's made for a good environment. I may review my notes. I kind of listened, and then I thought, how would they like to hear this? And I just scribbled a couple things down. Different things that can come into play with sailing is a federal program, Navy cadets. I don't know if you know how big the program in Grimsby is of the Air Cadet Squadron. So they do, the federal government also does Army and Navy, and sailing is a big part of that. The Royal Hamilton Yacht Club does able sailing, and it's an opportunity to get disabled people out on boats, to get them sailing and to have that experience. And I'm also a member of the Canadian Power and Sailing Squadron. Most places that have any water activity for a yacht club or sailing or marina, they usually have a power squadron as well. It's a learning opportunity. When I heard there was up to 7,000 people coming here, without a doubt, a percentage of them will be people who are from the boating community. And some people, if they know that there's already an active yacht club, may specifically look at this area as the place to come. And I'll put a good word out for them. I don't know them, but I'm sure they're the best people possible. So you might also, again, want to actively pursue them. If you don't know much about sailing, there's 50 yacht clubs on Lake Ontario, approximately. Sailing clubs do what's called reciprocal, which means if we can stay at one night at your club for free, you can stay at our club one night for free. And many sailors spend their holiday, their weekends, back and forth to different experiences around the lake to have activities. A lot of the things you described are the very things that sailors would like to do, to go somewhere, to go for a walk, to take in a theater, go out for dinner, be able to get access to some groceries, and then they're on their way again. If I can just briefly review my notes to see what might be of helpful. The only thing I would end with is that I would suggest if I caught anyone's attention that to reach out to the people like Dalhousie Yacht Club or the Royal Hamilton Yacht Club to see if they'd be interested in putting in a remote location or assist the city with direction on how to establish a credible, helpful, good to all people type yacht club. So rather than ramble, is there any question that would help clarify anything I said or that might have sparked your interest? Because it may have caught you all off guard on that one, but I think it's important to get it in, to get into the thought process, if for no other reason to speak.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Is there anyone else present this evening that wishes to address the secondary plan? Please come forward and please come forward. State your name and spell it, please, for the clerk.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman.
My name is Janusz Derkacz. I live at 4859 Victoria Avenue North, which is the corner property from Victoria coming into the development. The street used to be called Dustin or Elizabeth Dustin. Actually, we bought the property from Dustin, so that's why that we like that name. One of the things that I was thinking of is the access of the Victoria Shores to the new development. There is a easement there between two houses, and that's I understand that this is something which we need in case of emergency, so there is a way to get there should the access from service road be not available. But what I would like to have a council to consider is to make it emergency vehicles only by not paving it, just make it looking like a regular walkway so people can walk, but cars would not be allowed. So in case of emergency, we have access. It's not very long, so even if you have a car driving with the lights and siren on, the people would have a time to move and make a way, and it would be conflict-free access, but again, only to the emergency vehicles. That's all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else wishing to speak to this application this evening? Sorry, this the secondary plan this evening. And Ted, seeing as you were with us last evening.
I promise not to repeat myself.
Well, yeah, I just want to make sure that you understand what we've garnished from your statement last evening with regards to the emergency road access.
Yep.
And obviously the delivery of letters and petitions opposing another road access, the blocking of the view, the Court Industries property with shading and whatnot, and the transportation impacts.
Certainly. I did want to comment on the development on Victoria Avenue, which I talked about the shading before. One thing that I heard in the presentation today was a green belt is between the residents and the development, the 10-story apartment building. That's not a green belt, that's a beach. And it's a well-used beach. Unfortunately, the shading from that building will block the sunshine in the early afternoon to late afternoon from that beach. It's a very well-used beach, and I certainly hope when we consider the development in that area, we look at the impact on another beach that is well-used in our neighborhood. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else here wishing to speak to this secondary plan? Please come forward. Please state your name and spell it, the last name for the clerk, and address, please.
I'm Lori Fothergill. Fothergill is Fothergill from 3328 Dustin Street. A lot of what I had wanted to say has been covered, but I just wanted to share some of my wonderings. I was wondering about, there was talk of the downtown being developed, meaning the new Prudhoms. Several times it was alluded to the word downtown. So I'm just wondering if there's any, who has a say in what type of services or businesses may be coming there. We talked about, I've heard about it being a destination, and what will people want to come there for? I've heard there's a park, there may be a walkway, there may be some hiking trails with limited parking and possible stores and restaurants. Just wondering how that will all work out. If you look at Charles Daly Park, they have a walkway and a nice beach. They have great parking. I'm also wondering about the amount of traffic on the highway and how that's going to affect people wanting to come to this area. Right now, I know the destination is the Tim Hortons and the flea market. And other than that, I'm not sure what else. Those I'm thinking will be gone. Possibly Tim Hortons may stay if there's a link directly to and from the highway for that. I guess I'm just kind of wondering who has the final say in what kinds of stores or services or businesses will be coming to that downtown area that will attract people. Why will people want to come here? The other thing I was wondering about is, I know we've talked a lot about the emergency road and the pumping station, the trees, the green space. There was talk about low rise and how the new development will only be 2.5 stories. And if you look at Dustin right now, all the houses that are along Dustin are bungalows or 1.5-story homes. I know there's talk of a buffer between them, but if something is 2.5 stories, it's going to be looking down upon the people that are in a bungalow or a 1.5-story. So just wondering if that can be looked at again. Looking at the green space, there was talk about a tree ratio, and I'm not sure how that will play into it. I believe it's up to the council to decide what that ratio may be, so I'm wondering what that may look like. I'm also wondering, Mayor Easton said about her stand on the ballard or bullards that will be possibly put up with connecting. I'm wondering with it being an election year, what our other two councillors may, if they can weigh in on their thoughts of what they may be thinking with regards to that connection, because I think that is still a big concern to our existing community. And I think the bullards would be a reasonable, people would be more satisfied with that. Those are just my wonderings. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody else wishing to speak to this secondary plan? Please come forward. State your last name.
Robson.
And please spell it in your address as well, please.
It's ROBSON, and I represent Moyer Diebel, 2674 North Service Road. And really, I'm just looking at what kind of impact my company would have with the, I guess there's some development going around the North Service Road and Jordan Station. So really, I'm just reaching out for more information on that as our company does grow. We are kind of landlocked and just looking for opportunities, particularly across the road, but I see that is now being taken over. So, you know, I'm just looking to reach out to somebody.
Certainly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Certainly, you could certainly address the economic development officer at the town. He'd be able to help you with that. So.
Yeah. Thank you.
Is there anybody else wishing to speak to the secondary plan this evening? Is there anybody else wishing to speak to the secondary plan this evening? Just one last person wishing to speak. Sir, please come forward and speak. If it's a different item, if it's new information, or that would be great.
Again, it's Janusz Derkacz, 4859 Victoria Avenue North. I just have one question, whether the area that used to be 10, 15 years ago, the fruit market on the corner of next to the exit from the ramp to the service road, which is used currently as for MTO, I believe, as a storage area, whether this thing is going to be there forever, or it's temporary only and it will be redeveloped possibly back as a fruit market.
Did you want to just...
Through you, Mr. Chairman, the property in question is actually part of the road allowance and under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Transportation. So any future use of that would be up to the Ministry of Transportation to decide. Like I know right now they're using it as a staging area. At one time it was used as a farm market. I know on the other side there's a parking lot. So really, future land uses in that area, because they're actually part of the overall road allowance, would be up to the Ministry of Transportation. It's not really part of the secondary plan area.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So last speaking tonight will be the primary property owner's representative from IBI Group, Angela Wanamizi. Sorry, I probably messed her name up. Did a better job of it last night. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. It'll be a little bit the same as yesterday, but I heard some new concerns and I would just like to comment on some of them. But as you stated, I am Angela Bonamici with IBI Group, and we represent FBH, the landowners of 80 acres, which is adjacent to Victoria Shores. FBH, with the help of IBI, has created a vision for their land. This is to create a complete community that has pedestrian-friendly streets, a variety of uses ranging from commercial, mixed-use, residential, and employment uses. They're adding walking trails and a waterfront promenade to connect the community with the existing community. And basically, it's kind of out of the realm of what is the normal, but through this vision, they have had urban designers on this, landscape architects, structural engineers, climate consultants, to try and make the best vision that ensures a good quality life for the existing residents and the future residents of this area. As such, we have had extensive involvement through the process of finalizing the secondary plan. We have attended each and every open house and public meeting and have worked closely with town staff to ensure our client's vision can be implemented. We are very pleased to say that this recent version of the secondary plan implements about, I believe I said yesterday, 95%, so I'm going to stick with that number. We feel that there are minor edits that we need to allow for 100% of our vision, but working with town staff, we don't see this being an issue. From the beginning, we have been listening to the concerns of the residents because they are our neighbors, and we have and will continue to address them through our design. I did hear some points tonight, which I would like to just clarify to kind of hopefully ease people's concerns. I know that the councilors had a concern about parking, and that is a very detailed thing, which is within the zoning bylaw. It gets very specific to the uses, how many parking spots you need for an apartment building or a commercial, whatever the commercial use is. These will have to be considered in our design. We've already taken into account, if we're going to have a waterfront promenade, you want to maximize on-street parking. And if it is going to be a destination, you do need parking for the visitors, not only for like the residential visitors, but also people coming to enjoy the land. So we have been considering that. That will, when we do go with our next steps, which will most likely be a draft plan, and then with supplement site plans for apartment blocks and everything, that's where you will see we have to accommodate for parking. We have to make it work with the engineering. That's our next steps as well. Some other points I took into account. I do understand that you do want new innovative measures incorporated, and we do plan on doing that. That's why why FBH has involved landscape architects and urban designers. I want to be careful with saying LEED certification because it is very hard to get a building to be LEED certified, but we do want to put in green roofs, low impact designs, whatever that is to help with it and do innovative technologies throughout the property. The secondary plan, I know there was a comment about non-native species and everything. Our landscape architect has reviewed the secondary plan, and on her guidance, it was, you don't want to restrict it to just native because that in itself does have its own issues. But, obviously there would be native species. We do have a few landscape architects on this project already. Once again, we are going to be doing the studies to ensure that if potential natural areas need to be preserved, then they will be. So when we do our draft plan, there will be an environmental impact on an ESA, a transportation impact study. So we are prepared for all these, and just know that, these will be a part of our next steps. So having said that, I just want to thank everyone for listening, and we look forward to working with the town on this project.
Thank you very much. Is there no more speakers this evening? I'm going to declare this public hearing closed for tonight. We will now deal with the preliminary report regarding PL 1801 Prudhoe Secondary Plan. I have a motion moved by Councillor Foster and seconded by Mayor Easton. Repeal 1801, application PLOP-A 2016-0108, Prudhoe Secondary Plan. For the reasons outlined in PL 1801, it's hereby recommended that this report regarding the draft Prudhoe Secondary Plan, PLOP-A 2016-0108, be received for information, and that a recommendation report be prepared upon receipt of all agency and public comments. Do you have a question to the motion, Councillor?
Yeah, we're just making sure that everybody understands where this motion is going. This is more or less just receiving the report that we have got at this point, and making sure that we are giving direction to staff to start into the next process, which is building the final recommendation report, which will take into account all of the items that have been discussed and all the items around the original plan. So this is more or less a housekeeping item. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much for the clarification, Councillor. And your pleasure on the motion? The motion is carried. We have no delegations for this evening. We have no correspondence for this evening. We have no further reports for this evening. Are there any councillor inquiries? Seeing none. Any notices of motion? Seeing none. Any announcements? None. There's no closed session this evening. There being no further business, I call this meeting adjourned.
Hello, how are you doing?